Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining today for my talk, The Problem with HTML5 and CSS3. Um, we're going to look a little bit onto the problems that we nowadays have if we talk about HTML5 and CSS3. But before we start, let me quickly introduce yourself and don't be confused why I have my mobile phone in the hand. I'm just controlling the slides here. So my name is Quentin Albert. I work at Clockadoo as a senior front-end developer. Um, I've been working on the web for about 10 years now, and I have a huge passion for CSS and mainly native web technologies. So you might have already seen it. There's no PHP on there because I'm not a PHP developer, to be honest. Um, I don't know why I wear the shirt. Um, um, my current technology stack is mainly React focused. I build websites as well as applications, and with that I use Next.js or Astro. But without any more talking around it, as I already said, we have a problem in web development. And I know this is a bold claim, but let's quickly dive into it. Who of you has been working as a web developer for more than a decade? Probably most of you have worked on the web longer than I have. Do you remember when HTML5 and CSS3 got introduced? A couple of people. Okay. Do you remember some of the essential features that were introduced with HTML5 and CSS3? Just if someone does, just shout out one of them if you want to. Nope? Okay. Because most of the people nowadays don't even know what we were missing back then. HTML5 and CSS3 bought some cool features like transitions and animations because those were just not possible about 10 to 12 years ago in the browser. We didn't have an option for border radius, and Lemon already told that at the start keynote today. We didn't have shadows. So no box shadows, text shadows. I don't know who of you uses text shadows on a regular basis, but we didn't have those. We also didn't have opacity. We didn't have semantic HTML tags, so stuff like article, main, nav, footer, all of those weren't there. We basically the most fundamental feature that we were missing is media queries. We didn't have a responsive web back then. Okay, up until this point, you might think, okay, Quentin, nice, but where's the problem here? Let's go a little bit deeper. I found a job offer online, and I need to get a little bit closer here. Let's look through these points. Good business English in intercultural competence. I think I'm quite good at it, so perfect, check. Bachelor's degree or higher in computer science, software engineering equivalent. Yeah, I have that, perfect, check. Good grasp of object-oriented programming, module and modularization. I have that, perfect. Positive, self-report, can-do attitude, proficiency, sorry, German, in SQL, HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript, ability to analyze and solve issues in existing and new code. Okay, all of you know why you're here, so the problem here is obvious. HTML5 and CSS3, this is a recent job offer. What does this even mean? And you might think, okay, this is a single job offer, but I found job offers at multiple companies. BMW, Mercedes, SAP, Visa, and also Amazon that were looking for developers who know CSS3 and HTML5. And I think most of you would argue that they know HTML5 and CSS3. But you can also argue that basically this is HTML5 and CSS3, so the contrast is quite off, but let's go back a little bit. So I know how to set a border radius. I know opacity. I have a transition on here, and I even have a media query, so I'm totally qualified to do this job at Amazon, I guess. But let's be honest, this is not what I'm searching for. And here we go into the first problem, because what skills are they actually searching for when they talk about HTML5 and CSS3? Problem one, I call it the meaning, because depending on who you ask, you might get a different definition of what HTML5 and CSS3 actually means. Perfect. Already said that. if we look into the job offer, we can probably some recruiter did that. So if you ask a recruiter what HTML5 and CSS3 means without any technical background, it basically means this. The latest features that are relevant for the success of our company, because HTML5 and CSS3 are the latest versions. So yeah, they're probably quite important. So we just call it a name and say HTML5 and CSS3 is necessary. But what we also saw in the job offer is there was no SQL versioning, there was no JavaScript versioning, there wasn't ES6 or anything behind it. So why is it so special? What's so special about HTML5 and CSS3 there that you need to define that version for this specific job? But let's look at some other meanings, or let's look at some other visions onto HTML5 and CSS3. If you ask a spec writer, for example, HTML5 and CSS3 means basically everything and every feature that is part of the current HTML and CSS standard, because HTML5 and CSS3 is the latest version, and the version contains everything from the previous versions, so every feature. And officially, if you look into the specs, they're defined like this. So every feature that came out in the last 10 years is officially part of CSS3 and HTML5. But we already see quite a big difference between the latest features, and you need to know everything. And if I'm being honest, if you ask me, or probably most of you, if someone talks about HTML5, or if you're younger and haven't worked on the web for over a decade, HTML5 and CSS3 basically for me means a set of features that was introduced into the browser more than a decade ago. So just as things we just saw, like media queries, border radius, and the other stuff. And all of the new stuff that came afterward, like Flexbox or dialogues or whatsoever, we'll look into a couple of those later on, they aren't properly grouped yet. And I've also seen people who are not quite sure how to define this, just saying HTML5 and CSS3 are a subset of features, not even defining when the features were introduced, but just a subset. For some people, the Flexbox is in there. For other people, Grid is in there. For other people, it is just media queries. I've heard a couple of definitions, actually. And with these different meanings, there comes a new problem. So let's look into the second problem and actually look at a couple of the things that are fundamentally different if we look back 10 years. I call this problem the best practices because things were different 10 years ago. And if we look back 20 years, we'll probably see tables and stuff, but I wouldn't want to go that far back. So let's look at a couple of the things that have fundamentally changed, and I would argue are best practices that you need to know now and you didn't need to know back then. The first category is called layouting, because I don't know, when I started web development, HTML always looked like this. And I don't know if a couple of you know this, but I don't know if a couple of your websites still look like this, but when I started, Bootstrap was a thing like Tailwind or React or any JavaScript or CSS framework is now. It was basically the jQuery of CSS. I would call it like this, because building layouts back then was a pain. No one wanted to do it. It was just hard, and we will look into what you needed to do in the next slide. But what Bootstrap has done is create a layout framework where you just define different columns on different elements, and you could put those next to each other, because we didn't have display flex or display grid back then. So it was actually quite a pain. And if we look at how we did this back then, we needed floats. Legendary floats that I don't quite get how we used to work with those back then, and I couldn't do it now if you ask me, but yeah, this cool clear fix thingy that everyone knew was a thing, but no one even knows what it does. It was a pain. And for all of you who haven't worked like this, you will probably use floats if you nowadays want to do something like letting text flow around an image, because this is the only use case people nowadays have for display for float. But floats were basically saying these elements are sitting next to each other, but if you do that, the browser couldn't calculate the height anymore. So you needed this element called clearfix to tell the browser okay, this is a new element that's coming after the clear fix, so please calculate what the size of all the elements above should be. And it was just a pain. If we look at how we would do this right now, it's as easy as, oh, smooth animations. Display flex and column gap 1 rem. Because what Bootstrap has done back then is putting margins between everything, anything and everything, putting paddings around stuff, pulling them out negatively so they just fit into one column or one row or one container. I think the people who work with Bootstrap know what I mean. But I think this is a little more effective. And I mean, in theory, both produce the same result. So what are those people looking for who are asking for people who know HTML5 and CSS3? Because both produce the same result. But we have more of those topics. Layout was just a single thing because obviously we could do the same thing with grid, but I won't dive into grid right now. But we have some more fundamental changes that were different back then. One of them is preprocessors, because everyone was using a preprocessor back then. I mean, probably most of you in this room are still using something like SCSS, SAS, LESS, PostCSS, or you name it. And before that time, CSS looked like this. You had multiple color definitions and multiple styles in one section right here, and you had no variables. You had repeating section segments, so people thought, okay, would be great if we could just introduce some cool new super language that would make CSS easier and just compile it before, and we can just run it in the browser and it will look like this, but we can write it easier. So what happened with the introduction of SCSS is that it looked like this. Do I have code highlights in here? Doesn't look like it, but I mean, you can probably follow it by if I just say what's happening here. So we have two variables defined, and we just nested every selector, so we don't have to repeat them all the time, because all of them were assigned to the section as we saw on the previous slide. So even though we have approximately 5 more lines of code, this is far more readable because you know all the styles are assigned to the section. You have variables that you could change at any time. But this still has some issues because these variables are just existing at build time. So if you wanted to change out the variables, if you wanted to adjust the variables, or if you have, for example, a website with different themes, like dark and light, you needed to build multiple CSS files with just those variables exchanged. And this was quite a pain, to be honest. So what we got was, perfect, custom properties. CSS custom properties, variables. I hope all of you know these by now. They work basically the same. They have inheritance, so they can follow the cascade. You have them accessible everywhere if you define them on the root or the HTML or whatever you want to. And you can just use them anywhere. And some of you might already see it. Not as much has changed on the slide because indeed, nesting is a native feature too. You can write CSS like this, and this is available in the browser. Nesting isn't something that's only working in SCSS and less and so on anymore, because nesting selectors, like we were used to a couple years ago, is a feature since about 1.5 years, I guess, that is implemented in every evergreen browser. So if you are just using preprocessors to have some nesting, you can probably just switch to native CSS and achieve the same, far more performant without an additional build step. I think I wanted to say something other than that. I don't know. One other thing that preprocessors introduced were functions like lighten and darken, because designers always wanted, like, if you do the hover effect, please just darken the color 10% or lighten the color. So you had to define some magic functions to lighten and darken colors or mix colors together. I don't know why you would do this, but these were functions that are available in SCSS. And we can actually do all of this and even more and even better native in CSS nowadays as well. Because don't worry, I will switch to the individual lines. So you can just look at the top right now. because we now have functions that help us with that. Let's look through those examples. First, I define a new variable called primary with just red in there. And in the past, if you wanted to convert colors, for example, to hex or to RGB or whatsoever, you needed additional functions from SCSS. Or if you were using custom properties already, you needed to save each individual property of an RGB color like R, G, and B individually, so you can calculate with them and create new colors. Now we have new functions. And the first one isn't a function, my mistake. It's called relative color syntax. And what it does is it allows us to create a new color relative from an old color. Yeah, from a color that we have. It's actually quite interesting because I'll quickly sit down so I can move my cursor around here. I think you should probably see. I can draw. Yeah, okay, nice. What you notice is this keyword. And what it basically does right here is it says, create a new RGB color, so whatever function is in front of it, from my variable. In this case, our variable that includes red from the top here. And because of this keyword, we get additional parameters. And these parameters are all the parameters that you need to pass in the individual color function. So for RGB, we always get R, G, and B. If you look at the next line, that's also a new color function, OKLCH, we get L, C, and H, and we can do everything we want with them. So for example, in this specific case, what I do is LCH stands for lightness, chroma, and hue. So this is other than RGB, not red, green, and blue. And by decreasing or increasing the lightness, I just do darken and lighten. So what I just do here is I create a new OKLCH color from my hex value up there. And by calculating the value of the L, that's not a 1, it looks like a 1, sorry for that, plus 0.1, I increase it by 10%. Because lightness only goes up to 100%, to 1. And the same can be done with darken, because I can just decrease it by 0.1, so 10%, and it will just be darkened. And we can do so much more. We can, for example, add an optional parameter that's available in every color function that's available, opacity or alpha channel. And just by placing these 50% at the end there, I'm telling the browser to use my primary color, which includes red, leave RG and B, so all of the different values untouched, so it just contains red, and just add 50% transparent. So we have a now 50% transparent red color, and if I change my red color up there, it will just change down here as well. So we can make relative colors, and we can create a whole color palette just from a single color. But I have a couple of more examples and 2 more functions out there. For example, if you use HSL, you can also create like a complementary color just by rotating the hue by 180 degrees. So you can just do the same and calculate the H with 180 plus 180, and you just completely rotate the hue and have the complementary color. So the most important thing right here is that you, in each function, you see it here with HSL, you have all the parameters that the function accepts at the end with an optional opacity or alpha channel parameter at each function. And you can calculate and do whatever you want to do with them. Quite cool, to be honest. The next thing, I don't know why you would use this if you've seen the above, to be honest, but it exists. We can now mix colors. So for example, if you have 2 different colors, you can now say, please mix these colors together in given space. This is sRGB space, but color spaces are a completely different topic, with a ratio of 50-50. But you can also say, please mix 2 colors with a different ratio by just saying something like this RGB color with 25% ratio, and this RGB color has the rest of the ratio, so 75%. So you can mix colors. And all of this could have been done with preprocessors quite a while ago, but in my opinion, this is a better thing, and I would argue that this is the best practice nowadays if you use if you want to achieve such thing. Okay, so far for preprocessors. Let's look at a couple more things that probably more of you know. For example, dialogues. I think this is one of my favorite things because people tend to do it so completely over-engineered. And this is one of the things, if people come to me and apply for a job, I ask if they know if, how they would implement a dialogue, because this is the easiest thing you can do nowadays. Most of you probably know something like this. A div with a backdrop in it, and all of this is on the top layer somewhere. And you place it fixed because you don't need to want to scroll. You have this backdrop with a cool background with a transparency so people can see that there's something behind it. You have the dialogue itself in the middle. Okay, so far so good. If we would optimize this code a little bit, we could end up here. Maybe someone knows this code better, because with display grid, we can place things on top of each other quite easily. We could just use place self-center instead of absolute positioning. But this is not the end, because let's be honest, a dialogue with this just a little bit of code wouldn't do anything. We need JavaScript to close it, JavaScript to open it. And don't forget the accessibility aspect, because we most likely also need a focus trap. And for those of you who never heard of the word focus trap, because I heard that this is not a common known term, focus trap is basically the term for trapping the user's focus inside of the window. Because if you open a dialog, you don't want keyboard users to be able to exit with the focus navigation outside of the window, because they will never be able to close it again. So what you do instead is trapping the user inside of the dialog so they can only interact with the dialog, because normally a dialog, like a cookie concept or something, is nothing you would just X away, but rather wait for an action from the user, like reject or accept. So you also need this, and you probably won't implement it yourself, because if you have ever looked into the implementation of such things, they most likely set tab index -1 everywhere on the whole page. There are NPN packages for that, but I would not recommend using them, because since about 4 years, we have a dialog tag, and the whole thing looks like this then. We have a dialog tag, and the dialog tag comes with a couple of things that we'll see on the next page, but there's a dialog. It opens in the top layer. The top layer is a new layer. So if your colleague decides to put a z-index of 10 million somewhere, this dialog will still open on top of it, because the top layer is above every z-index that you can set. And the form inside of there is actually a native option to close the dialog without any JavaScript, because when the form is submitted, the form method dialog tells the dialog to close. And this is the only CSS we need, because everything that we've done so far, putting it on top, centering it in the middle of the page, having a backdrop behind it, is all native in the browser. And we can override these styles at any point. So just to have a full overview, we have a native modal, and we also, maybe some of you have heard about popovers. I won't get into those right now, because popovers are a step further, where you can completely abandon the JavaScript part and do, because right here you still need to open it somehow. But there's a new thing called popovers where you can even open the dialog without any JavaScript. But we won't dive into that right now. So we have a dialog, completely native. It's rendered on top layer, so no z-index problems. We have a stylable backdrop where you can put any color you like with a pseudo element called backdrop. We have a native focus trap, so the tab order will still remain inside of the dialog. You cannot escape it. We can close it via escape. at any point. So this is also native. It's fully accessible, and it has a JavaScript API to open it, to close it, to see if it's open, and to do a couple of other things. Next, accordions, because I feel like not enough people also know about this. Back then, if you wanted to get rid of JavaScript, you could build accordions like this. Just use a label and an input, and if the input is toggled, just display block on the content. That would be the easiest way to build a non-JavaScript accordion. But you could actually do this without any CSS nowadays, and you could do this without any JavaScript because there's a thing called details and summary, and it has been in browsers since about, I think, 6 years or something, but people are just not using it. So it looks like this. Uh, you will see on the next slide where there are two of them. Details right here is the wrapper for, I would say, the accordion or collapsible or however you want to name it. And the summary is just the header. So the accordion head where it just says a single line. And for a long time, people argued, okay, but my client says the accordions should collapse each other because they are accordions. And for a long time, this has not been possible. But since about just a couple of months, but it is a progressive enhancement, I would say. You can actually do this without any JavaScript as well, because we've had such things on radio buttons where you just can select a single one of them. So why not just put the same technology behind details and put them into a group by applying a name to them? If you now open one of the details, the other will automatically collapse. So this is pretty new, but I think it's pretty cool. If you need this feature and your client says, we cannot get around it, all the others should collapse, and you really want to use detailed summary, you can just sell this as a progressive enhancement and tell them it will work everywhere in a year, but we don't need JavaScript, we don't need any additions, and in all Chromium-based browsers, so about 70% or 80% of all users will already see a fully functional collapsible accordion this way. Okay, next topic, and this is a quite large one to be honest. The box model. Um, the box model, when CSS3 got introduced, looked like this. And to be honest, it still looks like this. There are no additional layers around here, but who of you have already heard about logical properties? Okay, perfect. There are actually a few problems with a box model like this, because let's look at this button. Pretty. Do you see the problem? No? Okay. Okay. Do you see the problem now? You see, because you know logical properties. But do others see the problem? No? Okay. So it's easy in the Western countries to just think left to right, but there are actually people who write from right to left. And for them, left and right are the same, but the browser renders everything the other way around. So the button for them would look like this. And as you can see, there's no margin in between. And the whole thing isn't centered anymore because the margin is still to the right. So this is actually quite odd, to be honest. And if the problem here is everything we've done so far is defining stuff in physical directions, because top, right, bottom, left is pretty physical. I mean, top, bottom, right, and left are the same no matter where you are, in which country you are. If you are in Arabic countries, people won't say that left is right and right is left. They just write the other way around. So what the CSS working group has come up with is we can't solve this by just reusing the box model or just turning it around, because people back in the days already fixed stuff like this by turning everything around if you needed internationalized pages. If you, for example, 10 years ago or something, a client came to us and said we wanted to have a new page for the Arabic room, and all of the paddings and margins were completely off. So he asked us to, for this specific case, completely rewrite the CSS and completely revert. Oh, Revert? No, flip. Flip all the margins and paddings, so it will work. Because, and now if the CSS working group has decided that we would just implement it in our existing box model, this whole thing would break. And as we all know, CSS and HTML is fully backward compatible at all times, so this can't be done. So what they instead decided to do is introduce a completely new box model like this. We now have, or for about 5 or 6 years, have had all these properties without any physical directions. The directions are now called inline and block because if you think in normal way, the page is always rendered from top to bottom. So this is the block level, and from left to right, inline, this is the inline level. And we have inline and block start and inline and block end. Because there's actually one more problem. There are Asian countries where you write from top to bottom. So you also needed to keep this in mind. So, oh, I forgot my favorite slide, to be honest, because we now don't have any physical directions anymore. You may have already seen it if you work with display flags, because there is no such thing as justify content justify content left and right. They're called start and end. That's the same reason. If you work with CSS Grid, nothing there is called left and right. The stuff is called start and end as well. That's the reason for that. But we have border radius, and border radius has such cool things at like top left radius and bottom right radius. Those things are now called border end radius and border start radius. Wonderful naming. I love it. So everything that has been physical is now also available in logical. So our beloved float left is also now called float start, and float right is called float end. Text align left is called text align start. Text align right is called text align end. All these properties are available since 5 to 6 years, and you don't have to do this. I need to clarify this. You don't have to do this. But if you want to get internationalization for free and want to be compatible with all countries, let's say it this way, or with all the people who are living in Germany, because I've had a colleague back then who was from Syria. He was also reading from right to left, and he is in Germany. You can just use those and it will work at any point. The other cool thing, I didn't put it in here, is we now have single dimensional properties. So we can do something like margin inline to just define left and right, and margin block to just define top and bottom. So we have new values there as well. But without going too much into this, the solution would look like this. Margin inline end, and no matter how you put what writing mode you're writing in, it will always work. That's it from the second problem, but we have another problem because this is just the tip of the iceberg. We've already looked into quite a few things, but we have a couple more things, to be honest. We've already seen Flexbox, but we also have such things as grid, custom properties, logical properties. We've seen those. We have variable web fonts. We have stuff like ad supports, who nearly no one knows because, I don't know. Who of you knows ad support? Okay, that's more than last year. Perfect. I mean, when the quota grows, perfect. We have stuff like user preference queries who weren't available back then. So stuff like, do you want to have animations, dark mode, light mode, all the stuff. And this is just, all of this is stuff that was introduced into the browser about 8 years ago. So there's even more to see. And I feel like, especially in the last couple of years during COVID, CSS and HTML got into the background because people were looking more and more on those JavaScript frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, and so on, but not diving into the depths of native web development anymore. So we have more features. We have container queries who are completely revamping how we think responsively. And I would love to tell you more about it, but those topics are all so big without any advertisement. I normally do a workshop. I think it's in October or something here. And I only talk about a subset of these things that I'm going through now. And the workshop goes 8 hours. So I don't know how much time you have, but I have to be at the train station in about 2 hours. So I think we won't get there. So we have container queries. We have nesting. We have seen this, and you know this. We have style queries where we can style things depending on the styles of other things. So we can just query styles of specific elements and see whether they apply or not and style stuff accordingly. For example, if you work in a component-based system, if you work with React or whatsoever, you probably have something like properties where where you tell an element to have a specific theme, like this item is big, this item is small, and according to this, multiple classes in the elements are toggled. You can do this completely in CSS by now because we have such things as style queries where you can see if a custom property, for example, is set in an element and apply styles on multiple child elements accordingly. We have things like popover. I already teased it. We have cascade layers, and cascade layers are completely underrated in my opinions because because you can completely restructure your CSS and tell things that they have a higher importance than other things. So you can override IDs, for example, with plain selectors just by introducing cascade layers. And this might sound confusing, but I just throw stuff in here so you probably remind them afterwards and can just Google them because they are so cool. We have stuff like view and scroll timeline. And if you've been on Twitter X lately, you've probably stumbled across them because um, this is one of the things that just got introduced lately and is one of the few things that are solving so much issues that are recently been solved with JavaScript because we now have an option to animate stuff based on the position of scrolling. Stuff you usually have done with frameworks like GSAP, for example. You can now specifically detect where an item is in terms of scrolling with pure CSS and animate it with this value in mind. Same goes with view transitions, also one of these cool new things you might have heard of. You can create transitions from one page to another, real pages. I mean, this is probably something that's pretty cool for everyone who is working with PHP, because in single page application land, you were able to do this for quite a while because these are just two JavaScript files that are exchanged. But you can create real transitions between page navigations. So there's a real call to a new page there, and you can transition between them. Sounds like magic. To me, it is magic because something like two screenshots overlaying and auto animations and stuff is happening, but there are great talks and great free courses, I think from Google online, where you can look into this stuff. We also by now have math functions like sinus, cosinus, so all trigonometric functions. We have power, we have modulo, we have all those functions available in CSS that have been missing for so long. So I would not say we are on par with JavaScript, but we're getting there. We have add property. That's similar to custom property or variable definitions, but you can define types. So types in CSS sounds a bit weird, but yeah, you can actually define a syntax that a specific variable has to follow. So you can create something like fake Boolean, or you can tell a variable that it could only contain colors or numbers. That's a thing in CSS by now. We have has. Nice sentence there, but yeah, we have has. And it has been known as parent selector for about 5 to 10 years, I think. And it has finally shipped for, I think, 7 months or something, but it is there. Same for subgrad, which people were asking for about 10 years. We have new color spaces. I already mentioned it because of the sRGB thing, but we actually have more than just the RGB colors we were available right now. Relative color syntax, we looked into this. We have add scope. I won't get into this. We have anchors without any JavaScript, anchor stuff to specific elements on a page. For example, a tooltip that is always over a word or something, or a navigation that's popping up from a specific button. You can do this with plain CSS. only in Chrome by now, but you can do it. And it is being implemented. And we have stuff like invokers, does, which is, those are not implemented anywhere, but are quite promising because what they do is allowing HTML elements to invoke other elements without any JavaScript. So for example, if you have a button that opens an accordion, you can do this without any JavaScript. If you have a button that clicks another button, you can do this without any JavaScript. It's quite new, it's experimental, but it's promising. And there's so much more. Okay, I thought I am a bit too fast. Now I'm a bit too slow. I'll speed it up a little bit. The problem numbers. I only have the numbers for CSS right now, but I think you'll get it. So the initial version of CSS3 has had 361 features. If we look at the full set of features right now, we're talking about 801 features. So there are about 450 features that are HTML5 and CSS3, but somehow also not. Okay, so how do we solve those problems? And I think the problem is, the solution is known, and I think the solution is obvious. We need new versions because, I mean, PHP does it. I mean, JavaScript does it. ECMAScript does it. We have versions anywhere. People know what came along with what version, but we don't have those in HTML, CSS because of the living style guides. And you don't need to read this, but there's actually an open issue that was open in 2020 because even the CSS working group understood that we need new versions. But why would this help so much? Let's quickly go through the problems. The meaning. I mean, if you stop calling it HTML5 and CSS3, but HTML6 and CSS4 instead, you strictly know that this stuff belongs somewhere. I mean, it would not be the right solution to just put everything from the last decade into one version, if we are being honest, because no one knows all of the features that came out in the last 10 years. But it will solve this because people know what they should learn. I mean, we also have this with, for example, React, where with React 16, hooks were introduced, and people strictly know this is the version where hooks got introduced. And if you worked with React before, you probably don't know what we are doing, and you need to relearn the whole thing. The second problem, the changes. Right now, we just have a whole bunch of new stuff. Same goes with additions, and no one knows what was introduced and when it was introduced. But the cool thing is, people are actively working on a solution. On the one hand, there is the Baseline community. I don't know if you've heard about Baseline, but Baseline is an initiative that was introduced by Google where they group stuff into specific buckets to tell whether they can be used safely across browsers. And they are bucketing all stuff that was newly introduced into all browsers into buckets. Right here, we can see the 2023 bucket with all the stuff. There's even JavaScript functions in there. There's HTML in there. There's CSS in there. And you can see whether or not they are fully available and how much of the tests they pass. This is available right now only for 2023, but they are bucketing all the others as well up until 2012. So you can see which features got introduced when. And with that, we have a new tag called Baseline. It's also an MDN and can I use, and you can see if stuff is new or old and when it got introduced. Also, just recently, there was a RFC published called CSS level categorization. And what was basically done is put every feature since the introduction of CSS3 into a new bucket called CSS4, 5, and 6, because one version would just be too big, and see where they belong and introduce new categorizations for those versions. So at least for CSS, people can now see where stuff belongs, how old it is, and what they know, and with that, go into research whether they need to learn new stuff. Okay, half a minute. I just need one more minute. So what can we do? What can you do? We, as a collective. Even though it is technically correct, please stop calling everything CSS3 and HTML5. no one knows what you're talking about. And why there were only 5 companies there is because all the other companies stopped calling stuff HTML5 and CSS3. I was hoping to find something at Google or at Microsoft or whatsoever, one of the big companies, but all of them stopped calling the stuff HTML5 and CSS3 and just called it HTML and CSS because you need to know HTML and CSS, not this specific version. Second, please take part in the discussions and help the working community groups solving these problems. So if you, for example, have an issue with the versionings or whatsoever, give feedback to the RFCs, give feedback to baseline. You can also always participate and help structuring and grouping stuff. Just be part and help out. And at last, please don't forget that there's more than what you use right now. There's probably more than you know, probably more than I know, that's deep in there somewhere in the docs or in the specifications and no one knows about. But stop just waiting for the features to come at you or for someone to introduce them to you. Look at them for yourselves and stay motivated, looking and searching for those new things. And with 1 minute overtime, that's it. Thank you for listening. Yeah. I mean, theoretically, right now is a break. So if you have any questions, I will still answer them, of course. None. One. Yep. Mhm. Mhm. Modules, yeah. 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 The sheet right here says I should repeat what you said. That was too long. He disagrees with CSS4 versioning. Um, I hear you. You should probably comment this in the RFC because there are also people who were concerned with this. I mean, ECMAScript is doing the same. They have versions. They're called 2020, 2021. We also have, okay, with CSS3, it was a different thing because CSS3 had all levels at 3. But one thing that you are missing, if you want to look into something, just look into the new version, is the introduction of new features because CSS always introduces new modules. And if you want to find these modules that are in version 0 or 1, you need to get there somewhere and you need to have them somewhere introduced. So if you don't have something like a new version or some way to document these new additions of full features and full modules in CSS, it's pretty hard to keep track what got introduced. So I agree with you with the existing ones, but adding new features is quite hard, to be honest, in this regard. But we can discuss this afterwards. Yeah, yeah. Okay, no questions online. Perfect. Then that's it. Thank you for your time.